Hi, I have a question. How are we affording life right now?
How are people affording life right now?
How are people affording life right now?
How are people surviving financially nowadays?
Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox. You might know me from my company Based Politics or my podcast with Brad Palumbo, or you might know me from my political work where I've been working to pass legislation at both the state and federal level on issues like educational freedom, healthcare reform, tax reform, criminal justice reform. I helped overturn the death penalty in 3 different states. And along the way, I was working with both Republicans and Democrats, and I realized that we actually got along a lot more than the media wants you to think. The problem that we had is that we tended to agree on the problems that society was facing, but we had very different solutions for how we should address those problems. And largely, that was because nobody seemed to have a common understanding of how and why things got broken in the first place. I launched my first show Based to discuss these issues and help people understand the root cause of problems and learn how to think versus being told what to think. But when that show took off, Brad and I got busy building a company and I had to hit a pause on my original episodes. But the good news is I'm back with a shorter weekly format where we are going to dig into the issues and the questions that you're asking about how and why things are broken around you. And I'm going to save your sanity by giving you the correct way to actually fight back against all of the corruption we're facing. If you like this show, be sure to like, comment, and share it around. Now let's jump in. As you see in these videos, the internet is abuzz with people asking, how are people affording to live? And it's kind of ironic because at the same time, the Biden administration is running around claiming that the economy is great. He's labeling this Bidenomics. You should be celebrating it. Why aren't you celebrating it? Everything's awesome. But clearly, people feel very gaslit by this messaging out of the administration. And put simply, the facts just aren't adding up.
How are people affording life right now? How are people tackling this cost of living on the average American salary? I just watched a TikTok of a teacher who makes a teacher's salary. I don't know what state she's in, so I don't know how much she makes, but her 1-bedroom apartment is $2,000. And when she spends $2,000 on that 1-bedroom apartment, it doesn't even come with a washer and dryer. So she has to go pay an additional $2 every time she wants to use their washer and dryer. Okay, how does that leave her any extra money to spend? And then she said she had a $400 car payment, which some people were bashing her on that. But in today's economy with interest rates, that's really not that bad. And I'm sure she needs a dependable car. So you talk about teacher's salary, $2,000 in rent, $400 car payment. You got insurance, you got groceries, electricity. I don't understand how people are affording life right now, and it really makes me sad for some people. You have people who are like her. She's single, she has her own salary, or families where it just works out best for them for the mother to stay home. And if the father is just making an average American salary, how are they affording life without going in a bunch of debt? This lady who's a teacher started crying because she said she realizes on her salary and where she lives, she will actually end up in more debt. Then she will just continue to accrue more debt and more debt and more debt because her salary is not matching the cost of living.
Now, obviously, she's giving an anecdotal story here, but I did some research and her numbers track. So first and foremost, the current national median price on rentals is $1,967 according to Forbes. We won't even get into the housing market. I don't have time for that today, but obviously trying to buy a house is even harder. On top of that, I found that the average monthly car payment for new cars is $726, and the average monthly car payment for used cars is $533. Now, one more piece of information I think we need to look at before we can see if these people are valid in their claims that they can't afford to live is how much money are people actually making. Now, I like to look at the median in case you haven't noticed versus the average. I think it gives a more realistic picture of what most people are dealing with. And if you look at this chart that Forbes has, you'll see that there's a pretty decent gap between the median wages people make based on their ages. That makes sense. As you move up in your career, you make more money. But even in the best of circumstances, which is for 45 to 54-year-olds, we see that the median salary in the U.S. is $64,428. So let's say you're being really smart. You drive a used car. You work to find an apartment in a cheaper part of town. I want to discount this whole you should just live in really cheap areas because let's be real, most of the jobs are in cities and urban areas. That is where most people have to go to get their start and start climbing up. So it's not always realistic to tell people just move somewhere really cheap because there's often not jobs there. And because for some godforsaken reason, companies won't just give people remote work when they can. So put a pin in that. So let's say you do all these things, you're doing everything that you possibly can to save money. That looks like about $1,666 left over a month after just paying your rent and car payment for everything else. That is admittedly not a lot of money. We're talking insurance, we're talking gas, we're talking food, we're just talking basic needs, maybe daycare. That's before you even get into things that people might want to do or other small luxuries. And not only do you have to still buy all these things with that $1,600, you also have to recognize that the price for all those things has gotten a lot more expensive in the past 3 years. And what you need to know is that that is the government's fault, period. Not greedy companies, not your landlord, not your boss, the government.
Inflation does not come from trade unions. That doesn't mean that trade unions aren't grasping. Of course they are. But they don't produce inflation for one simple reason. They do not own a printing press on which you can turn out green pieces of paper.
Basically what happened is that politicians spent a ton of money in 2020 and 2021 that we simply did not have. And then because of that, the Federal Reserve printed a lot of dollars in order to pay for those things that we didn't have money for. And now as a consequence, you are ultimately picking up the bill for all of that, as many of us told you that you would all along. If you support big government and progressive spending policies, or if you support big government and nationalist economic policies on the right, you are voting for your own demise. Your beliefs are bankrupting you.
And people need to understand, if the government gives you 50 quid and the rich 50 grand, you will have more money and you will get less food, less energy, less housing, less healthcare, because money is the asset that we use to determine the distribution of real assets. Money does not make people rich. Money is how we determine distribution. You can have as much money as you want, right? If it doesn't buy you housing, if it doesn't buy you food, it doesn't matter, does it? So people need to understand that, because the government has struck on this idea here where we give every poor person a bit of cash and we give every rich person a ton of cash. And then the end result is prices go up a ton and ordinary people, they don't understand why they're getting poorer. Why? Because I've got more money. Why is it happening?
Inflation is simply when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods. It ultimately doesn't matter what your salary is. It matters what your dollar is worth, how much each dollar can purchase. That's why you could be making a lot more money in 2024 than you were in 2020 and still having less disposable income. Inflation devalues your dollar. The people who told you all along that we could just keep spending and that people were just being selfish to not pass programs like canceling student debt or giving people universal basic income or having free childcare, those people were lying to you. You cannot just keep spending without consequence. And the grumpy old people who were like grumbling all along about the debt and how we needed to restrain the government and limit spending, like those people actually had your best interests at heart. So if you're one of these people asking, how are people affording to live right now? You need to look at the actual situation and recognize if you have some culpability for creating the problem and change that moving forward. But back to the actual question at hand here, how are people affording to live right now? All of these things I've said can be true, and they are, but if you look around you, I'm sure you'll notice a lot of people don't seem to be struggling right now, despite living under those same policies and conditions as everyone else. So why is that? Why are so many people still able to thrive while you aren't? I think I have some answers for you. So the first thing to remember is that not everybody is broke. You live in a country with 331 million people. Out of those, there are 22 million millionaires in the US alone. And when you're looking at people online, which is, I assume, how most people are getting their information, they're looking at TikTok, they're looking at Facebook, they're seeing people live better than they are, and they're saying, how are other people affording to live right now when I can barely make ends meet? They aren't taking into consideration that what you're seeing is not indicative of how everybody is living. You're going to see many of those millionaires online who are still doing fine. You're also going to see people across the globe, many of whom also still have plenty of disposable income. It probably isn't that so many people are thriving, it's that you are being completely bombarded every day by images of people who are doing well because they're trying to sell you things. Ultimately, I don't think this is a bad thing. It can be aspirational. I personally like to see people who are thriving and doing well and learn what they did to get there, because in America and in other capitalist economies, you have the ability to work really hard and do well too. Many other people who didn't start off wealthy are still doing well right now despite these economic conditions, but they probably are working a lot harder than you think they are, and probably a lot harder than you are. Another thing I think people have to be aware of, though, this is really important research, and you need to keep it in mind if you're going to be participating in online spaces, because it can really impact your mental health and just your perception about the world around you. And that is that the internet has greatly changed how much exposure we have to people who have more money than us. Out in society, your neighbors, people you go to school with, people you go to church with, they're probably in the same or similar socioeconomic circumstances as you are. You wouldn't typically have seen millionaires and billionaires living their lives out next to you prior to the internet, except for maybe when you saw things about celebrities. But now you see this kind of content every day, and if you don't take into account how it can skew your perception, it really can start to mess with your head. One of my favorite podcasts is called Hidden Brain, and they had an episode a while back called Why No One Feels Rich. And they said if you've ever flown in economy class on a plane, you probably had to walk through the first class cabin to get to your seat. Maybe you noticed extra legroom, the freshly poured champagne. Maybe you were annoyed or envious. Social psychologist Keith Payne says we tend to compare ourselves with those who have more than us, but rarely with those who have less. And they say the psychology of income inequality and how perceptions of our own wealth shape our lives is something we should be paying a lot of attention to. So they ultimately brought Keith Payne onto the show to give an interview about his research. And he said some really important things that I think I found somebody summarizing pretty well on TikTok. Let's roll this clip.
Okay, this episode is another banger from Hidden Brain. There are two things about this episode specifically that I learned that I really want to share with you all. Basically, this episode is talking about how when we discover our income inequality, when we understand what level we are at, it affects us psychologically, which we all knew. But let me give two specific examples of just how we're affected. Okay, first example is on an airplane. When a plane has first class and we board from the front, which is usually what happens, and we have to walk past first class, there are higher rates, studies show, there are higher rates of air rage, people getting angry, rageful, fighting on airplanes. So when people have to walk past and see other people in first class and have to debase themselves and keep walking to their regular seats, so they're acknowledging their inequality, their lower status on the plane, they are more likely to have episodes of rage on the plane. Psychology tells us that when people feel a sense of deprivation and inequality, they are more likely to act out. And when people from higher social class or backgrounds are more aware of their higher status, they are more likely to be antisocial, to have entitled attitudes, and to be less compassionate. So basically, we love living in ignorant bliss and just not acknowledging our social statuses. And then when we are confronted with it, we act out. We feel some type of way, either if we realize that we are on the higher end or we are on the lower end. But specifically on the lower end, on airplanes, we are more likely to have episodes of rage when we have seen people in first class. Okay, example 2 is about athletes and their salaries. You know how there are the superstar players like LeBron or whoever who make so much more, 10-fold, 15-fold from their other, like, less famous, less superstar players on their team? This has an effect on their performance. So we think that when these players are getting paid these exorbitant salaries so much more, that they're going to perform better. They're more motivated, they love the attention, the ego, whatever. They're going to just do better. Studies show that in fact, when there is a huge discrepancy between salaries and there is more income inequality on a professional athletic team, the team actually performs less well. And it's because the team feels less cohesion, less collaboration. So this podcast talks about how, no, we're not fighting for everyone to get paid the same, but it's about relative salary. So instead of 30-fold for LeBron, 5 to 10-fold would have an actual effect on a team's performance, for example. Is this not utterly fascinating?
Comparison really is the thief of joy. And as they note in their research, you're very rarely comparing yourself to people who are doing less well off than you are. You're almost always going to be looking at people who do better than you. And so you really got to keep a check on your mind so that you don't become angry, that you don't allow it to affect how you view yourself, and so that ultimately you can continue to aspire to do better in life without letting it hurt your feelings or make you feel bad when others are doing better than you. But probably even more important than this phenomenon is another one that's occurring at the same time, and that's that the people you are seeing who seem to be doing better than you are buried in credit card debt.
Credit cards. Talk about them. What do you think?
Credit cards will kill you because interest rates are 21 to 23%.
Ooh.
You can have a credit card, and I recommend you do, but you always pay off the balance each month. And the reason you do that is to enhance your credit rating for the day you want to buy a home.
I detest credit cards. I am not one of those people that say credit cards can be a good tool. No, credit cards are sometimes a necessary tool you have to fool with to get your credit up, although not always. I started paying for my car when I was 16 and had perfect credit by the time I got to college and never needed to have a credit card. I think that it takes a person with extreme self-discipline to be able to use credit cards in a beneficial way. I know you can get points from them. I know there's all these other perks, and some people would say you're leaving money on the table. But at the end of the day, unless you are either a very wealthy or very restrained person, you're probably going to lose that bet, right? Credit cards are not going to take the gamble. They're going to win on the house. You've got to be aware that ultimately, unless you have those kinds of traits, they're probably going to take advantage of you and you're going to be on a very slippery slope. So I say avoid them at all costs. I have one. I very rarely touch it. But I seem to be the minority of Americans because according to research I found, credit card balances now total $1.08 trillion. And that's according to the latest quarterly report from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They said over the past 2 years, Americans' credit card balances have skyrocketed 40%. The average credit card rate is now more than 20%. And by the end of 2021, 401,293 Americans had filed for bankruptcy because that is ultimately where you end up when you cannot pay your debt. So when you see people who are living better than you, who are thriving, and you're wondering, how did they afford that vacation? How is everybody in Italy this summer? It's probably because they're up to their ears in credit card debt. I, like I said, have never used credit cards, especially when I was not doing as well. I avoided them because I knew that they were dangerous. And instead, I just learned to go without when I needed to. But even now that I do pretty well, I often look around and see people living extravagantly, it seems. And I'm thinking, I know they probably don't make as much money as me, or like they're probably around the same level. How are they affording to do all of this? How are they going on all these trips, buying these luxury goods? And I finally had to recognize it really is because most people are spending beyond their means. And ultimately, that is not a situation you want to put yourself in. Another reason people are thriving when you're not, though, and this is something I mentioned earlier, is that they might be working a lot harder than you.
I've heard of people who use their 9-to-5 job for solely their living expenses, and then they'll get a side hustle and they'll use all of that money for fun.
I know myself, I have always had multiple jobs ever since college. There's not a single point in my life where I've had just one job. That's how I've climbed as fast as I have and to where I'm at, is by being willing to work harder than other people. And I know that that's not something that's popular to say these days, but working hard really does still get you ahead. The U.S. Labor Department actually says that the number of people working a second job has reached a post-pandemic high of 8.4 million. That's about 6% of all women in the workplace and around 4.7% of men. They also note that more people are also using remote work skills to get added income, right? They're taking on multiple jobs while they're working at home, which I don't necessarily endorse, but if you can do the work, who cares? Take on as many jobs as you can get. Now, this is something that gets frowned on. I know that. There's people who say, like, my whole life shouldn't be spent working. And that's fine. If you don't want to have as much disposable income, you are free to try to live on what you can get from one job. You should probably focus on job hopping. You should look for other jobs that you could acquire with your skill set, find something where you can pay your bills. That's a prerogative thing. To me, I don't mind working. I like to get ahead. I think that working is good for you. I have been able to find ways to do work that I think are meaningful and that I actually would probably be doing even if nobody paid me. And because of being willing to work harder and work on the side, I've ultimately been able to pursue my passion. So I think that there's more benefits than negatives to this concept. But unfortunately, it's something a lot of people shove aside. As this woman referenced in this clip, she also sees people who will use one job to pay their bills and another job to save or pay off debt. I know multiple couples do that as well. There are really smart strategies you can use to get ahead. And also, I'll add lastly, just because you're working multiple jobs right now doesn't mean that you always have to do it. Many times you can use that strategy to get ahead and then live more comfortably. And that is something that many of these people who you see thriving on the internet are doing or have done. Lastly, there is this component of delayed gratification and good planning, as this TikToker mentions.
You have to live on less than you make, and you have to have a plan, and you have to be intentional. I meet people that make $30,000 a year that save money. I meet people that make $130,000 a year couldn't save money if they had to. It hasn't got anything to do with the income. It's got to do with you freaking controlling the person in your mirror. It's you.
Ultimately, it is your job as an adult to figure out how to pay your bills. There will always be hard times. Your job is to plan for them. That just is the reality. And you can work to mitigate how often there are hard times by supporting better policies and by working to limit some of the damaging types of ideas that have taken hold in the past couple of years. But still, you don't ultimately have control of that. So you do have to do your due diligence and work to cut costs when you need to and work to save for a rainy day. My family did not grow up wealthy. This is one thing I get accused of all the time on the internet. It drives me nuts. I have had people say I probably got where I am because of my dad, that I probably come from family money. And I have no idea where they're pulling that from because my dad's a pastor and I have 3 younger siblings. So there were 6 of us and we did not have money. Up until I was in probably 6th grade, my dad was preaching full time, which is really like the equivalent of 2 jobs. He was getting his PhD. My mom was homeschooling us, and we had to live on the church's property where he pastored just to afford housing. We did not come from money, but my parents were always responsible with money, and they worked to cut costs and to find situations to afford the lifestyle they needed in order to get us further ahead. So I learned a lot from that process. I learned growing up that we didn't get the top line cereal. I don't think I ever tasted cereal above the second shelf until I was much, much older. We had all of these things that would save money that I've actually still employed throughout my life, even as I have risen in income, even as my family has risen in income. And when I went to college and when I first graduated from college, I was in jobs where I was not making a lot of money. And I absolutely had to employ many of these things through my 20s. And it was fine. It wasn't bad for me. It was like having roommates. That's something that a lot of people don't want to do. I personally loved it. I loved my roommates, and that's something that a lot of people should consider. If rent is $1,900, you probably need to be splitting that with somebody else. If you have kids, you probably need to be splitting that with your significant other. You can live further outside of town like I manage. You can consider moving if that is something where you can find a job and it makes sense. You can look for better jobs. You can start businesses. You can contract on the side. And then most importantly, you can stop spending. I mean, let's be serious. When's the last time you actually went through your monthly bank account and looked at where your money's going and found ways to limit your cost? I still do this probably every 2 to 3 months because I'm anal and convinced that people are going to slip charges in on my bank account. And guess what? I still constantly find ways that I can save money. And then I can use my money on things I actually want to use it on, right? On saving, on being charitable and investing, on luxury items when I want them. So things like cutting streaming services, cutting your cable, stopping delivery services. That's something I did recently because I was spending way too much on Uber Eats. Getting rid of things like eating out, finding cheaper hobbies. So many people have these hobbies where they're going to Taylor Swift concerts or going to sporting events, and that's great if you can afford it. But you also can do much cheaper things like hosting friends at your house, having game nights. I recently picked up paint by numbers, excellent hobby, costs $10. You get a whole canvas, you can paint it. It takes probably 2-3 weeks to do. Endless fun. Okay. I'm just saying you can find a lot cheaper things to do with your time that are still enjoyable. You can learn a new skill. You can use the internet to learn to speak new languages or play instruments. The amount of free entertainment these days, there's no excuse. There's no excuse. There's so much you could be doing. You can eliminate memberships or find cheaper services. You can cut coupons. You can shop around. You can negotiate. I'm a really good negotiator. I will always haggle somebody down. I do it on jewelry. I do it on cars. I do it at gyms. I mean, I get free stuff all the time, and it's because I asked for it or I dwindled them down to very little. You can buy off brands. You can take on side jobs. I could go on and on this front because I've done it and it's benefited me. And I fully don't believe that most people are doing these things. I just don't. I think that you could always find ways to live more affordably. And so when we are living under conditions like we are right now, these are the avenues that you should be looking for. Okay, guys, I hope I thoroughly answered your questions on how people are affording to live right now. I think I covered all of our bases. So if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, comment, and share. Specifically, leave a comment and let me know what other issues you'd like me to break down for you. And until then, cut those credit cards. If you like this episode, be sure to check out other shows I'm involved with. You can watch my show Base Politics with my co-host Brad Palumbo, or you can check out Brad's show Damage Control, where he pushes back on the insanity from both the left and right when it comes to LGBTQ issues.